He's one of the most polarizing figures in history. A hero to some, a villain to others. He's categorically misunderstood and deeply controversial. But if there's one thing that everyone can agree on, it's that he was an unbelievable force on the battlefield. His biggest rival personally admitted that having him in command was like having 40,000 extra troops. The exact number of battles he won is, like everything in his life, disputed. But let's just say he did not lose very much. And behind the scenes, he's even crazier. A complete micromanager, perfectionist, intellectual, letter-writing workaholic. And despite being born over 250 years ago, the details of his life are pretty fascinating and oddly relatable, even today. Which he would be thrilled to hear, because he had a huge ego. And that's for good reason. I'm of course talking about Napoleon. And when I say that name, you probably already have an idea in your head of who you think he was. Being one of the most famous people to ever exist, almost everyone in the world has at least some concept for who he was. But at the same time, almost no one knows why he was. What I mean by that is most people know the name Napoleon Bonaparte and maybe some boring facts about his height or something. But when it comes to the nitty-gritty details about his personality and life that allowed him to win more than everyone else, and also fail miserably in the end, it's a little more blurry. I mean, look at Ridley Scott. He managed to make a $200 million film on the most interesting person in history boring, which is really impressive when you consider Napoleon's life. How could someone be the most gifted and intelligent strategist of all time while simultaneously making some of the stupidest military mistakes ever? How does one go from down with the monarchy to crowning himself emperor? And how does a single man become so powerful and loved, yet later despised and exiled by his own country? Twice. Is he charming and charismatic, or stiff and unlikable? The answer is Napoleon Bonaparte is complicated. And that's what makes him interesting. But I'll let you form your own opinion, because today I'm going to tell you the true story of Napoleon, hopefully in a way you haven't heard before. I'm going to tell you some interesting facts about his life and personality that I doubt you've encountered. Unless you happen to have read these two massive books where I got most of this information. Do you want to read these two massive books? That's what I thought. Let me summarize for you the craziest parts of the story that is Napoleon's life. Napoleon was born in 1769, but actually he almost wasn't born at all. When his mother was pregnant with him, she nearly died when her mule slipped crossing a river. No one knew at the time, but if that minor event would have gone slightly differently, it would have dramatically altered human history. Napoleon wasn't born in mainland France and didn't even learn French until he was 9 years old. When he was a teenager, he kind of despised the French, but he was also in the French army. You see what I mean about Napoleon being complicated? He never really spoke the French language well and was bullied for his accent. His grammar was terrible and his handwriting even worse. The reason he despised the French was when he was a child, they had taken over the island of Corsica, where he was from. Young Napoleon idolized a Corsican revolutionary named Paoli and formed a lot of his identity around being from an oppressed, downtrodden people. He spent months writing a literary work detailing the history of Corsica and their oppression from the evil France. It was terrible, and even his own mentors didn't hold back. They were like, maybe don't publish this? A lot of his early writing is pretty cringy, but this was mostly because he was a high-functioning, angsty teenager who wrote his thoughts down, kind of like young people posting stupid things on social media that they have to delete later. Napoleon's father tried his best to advance the social position of the Bonaparte family, so he kind of sucked it up to the French ruler in Corsica, which actually did end up helping to place Napoleon at a pretty good French military school. At school, Napoleon was bullied because he was small and awkward. He was a loner, often seen by himself reading or just in his own world of imagination. The other kids considered him a foreigner, an outsider, not really French. There's a pretty funny story about how he led his classmates in an epic snowball fight, which showed that he was destined to be the greatest general to ever live. You know, it's funny how when you grow up and become famous, people suddenly remember some pretty amazing childhood stories about you, no matter how weird and bullied you were. He did have a couple friends though, and he was well liked amongst the few he had. He seemed to like his studies more than people though, and would read everything. His favorite historical figures were Alexander the Great and Caesar, and that is some real life foreshadowing for you. He showed a real interest in music and philosophy, and enjoyed intellectual conversation at a young age. He missed his mother back home, who was much more sensible than his father, who had by now passed away. Napoleon struggled in the talking to girls department, and was a terrible dancer. When he did finally manage to lose his virginity, it was to a prostitute in Paris, and it took him like 3 tries because he couldn't even get a prostitute to sleep with him. And he was an army officer. So, how did you become a prostitute? This is a real conversation, by the way. Let's just skip the talk maybe and go right to your place. What for? Well, I could, keep you warm? Oh, you mean like sex? By the way, if you Google Napoleon because you want to make, I don't know, a YouTube video on Napoleon or something, pretty much all you can find are like these 3 very famous paintings. And these are great, but everyone's seen those, and I really wanted to show a different side of Bonaparte. So I set out to find imagery that was a little more interesting and rare. The answer turned out to be books. Really old books. So just a fun fact, nothing in this video is AI. It's all hand-painted and drawn, sometimes over 100 years ago, and now digitally scanned thanks to the Internet Archive Project and various university libraries. Throughout his life, Napoleon dreamed of being discussed and remembered when he was gone. The fact that the entire world now has access to thousands upon thousands of drawings, paintings, written accounts, and films created over multiple centuries, well, it would have overjoyed the little Corsican. How did someone from such ordinary beginnings end up being one of the most famous people in human history? Let's get back to the story. France was not at war at this time, which was rare, so Napoleon took a lot of time off. Namely, to go back to Corsica to deal with the financial mess his father had left the family in. In one of his little adventures back home, he got into a fair amount of trouble and was starting to feel at odds with his childhood hero, Paoli. He was wrapping up his passion project writing on the history of Corsica and decided to ask Paoli what he thought of it. Paoli basically told him it was a waste of time and that immature young people shouldn't write about history. Ouch. Napoleon must have been crushed to have his idol basically crap all over his expression of Corsican identity. During this time, a lot of his writing gets extra angsty, full of rants about how he couldn't imagine any man could ever fall in love, since love was so pointless and stupid. Napoleon could have gotten in even more trouble with France at this time because he overstayed his leave from the army, but luckily France was just starting up some old war again and they were short on officers, so they couldn't really afford to suspend Napoleon from service. Napoleon was reinstated to his artillery post and was starting to realize his future was in France, not Corsica. The artillery was perfect for him because it was a branch of the military that valued talent over status, which was not common back then. The highest members of society were there because they were born into it, and Napoleon was definitely not one of those. But this was all changing with the revolution. A talented, young, ambitious person could rise through the ranks with talent. All these exciting revolutionary ideas were in France. Well, Corsica and Paoli had been nothing but trouble for the Bonaparte family, ultimately rejecting them. He wouldn't forget that rejection, and from then on, he renounced his Corsican heritage and committed fully to France. However, France wasn't exactly welcoming either. There was a bit of a civil war and revolution happening, and a lot of influential families and aristocrats were being killed in the streets. The Bonapartes were pretty much nobodies though, so they flew under the radar, which was extremely lucky in a way. Napoleon had enough status to hold a respected position in the army, but not so much status that he was in danger from the revolutionaries. To remove himself from danger even further, he decided to write a political manifesto to assert his stance as a revolutionary Republican. Napoleon was learning to play the political game to stay alive at an extremely dangerous and violent period in French history. And now, the entire country faced an even bigger threat. Austria, Prussia, Britain, Spain, the Dutch, Sardinia, and Naples. They were being attacked on all fronts. France needed a hero. Maybe the hero France needed would be this guy, a pretty high-ranking artillery officer named Colonel Gonmar. Oh no, he just got horrifically injured. Who can we get to replace him? How about that guy that wrote that political manifesto? He's really young and inexperienced, but at least he's one of us. Yeah, sure, let's go with him. What's he gonna do? Take over France? Napoleon was only 24 years old at the time, but when he got to his new post near the British-occupied city of Toulon, it was pretty clear that he had special talents beyond his years. He went into a flurry of activity, gathering as many spare guns, ammunition, supplies, and anything that he could get his hands on in the region to strengthen the units he was in command of. Basically, he was a complete tryhard. However, his superiors there were pretty incompetent, gaining their high military rank through political favors rather than ability. Napoleon pointed out that the best way to take Toulon was to seize the forts overlooking the city's natural harbor. They went with his plan. When the first battle for the forts didn't go well, Napoleon reported his boss to his boss's boss and got him fired. But his new boss sucked too, and Napoleon actually called him a idiot to his face during a battle. And what's even better is the new general was like, yeah, honestly, fair play, you know your stuff. Napoleon made a big impression. He wasn't scared to join the fighting and personally went over the walls of the forts. His own horse was shot beneath him, yet he showed no fear. When issuing commands, he was clear and succinct, full of self-confidence and belief. But he had also learned to use flattery and persuasion to get people to listen to him more. He was always working at his post, and his energy and charisma was becoming magnetic. When he seized the forts, his enemies fled Toulon, just like he predicted. He was promoted to the rank of Brigadier General at only 24 years old. Not to diminish how impressive this was, but it is worth noting that France was flying through generals at this time because, all the revolution stuff. But the thing is, after that promotion, Napoleon's progress kind of petered out. He was commissioned to the French army in Italy, but they weren't really doing anything and he wasn't really in charge. His pay was decent enough to get his family a nicer house, but they didn't really seem likely to advance in society any further. And there was an even bigger problem. Maybe the biggest problem of all. Napoleon was in love.